And as I uncover the regulations and the different annexes of these different documents, I realize they know what they know what they're doing. I found that every few years, there's a new way of thinking about XRP that entirely reshapes the conversation. This one for me might be the biggest yet, because in my research, I've discovered that XRP needs to be categorized as this one thing in order for it to run the new financial system. If we get this classification wrong, it could mean XRP's role in this new financial system ends right here. Welcome back to the macro. In the last episode of the macro, we looked at the $500 million deal that was done between Ripple and Citadel and Fortress. And really, we asked the question, what is this money actually for? How is it going to be used? And what's its impact on XRP? But that question led me into a deeper place. And what I found hidden in the Bank of International Settlement reports, the standards for banking systems, and the latest wholesale CBDC pilots changes everything about how I see XRP fitting into this new financial system. In this episode, we are following that trail even deeper, and we're going to answer the question that entirely reframes every single assumption we've ever had about XRP. So in that last episode, we talked about how tokenization in this tokenized world where you have NASDAQ stock and then you might have Apple stock, between those two, there is a market. The regulations and the bank rules all suggest that these markets, specifically in a tokenized world, must have pre-funded accounts of a specific asset or some asset that enables the conversion for the two. Meaning that XRP would either have to be given by Ripple or bought off the secondary market to put into those markets and held there frozen, only used for that specific market. Meaning you have XRP out of circulation and basically frozen away means the price of XRP would go up. And all of that kind of makes sense on paper, but the more I dove in, the more I realized that something wasn't adding up. Because what I've realized, and you know, we've had this information before, but there's kind of like knowing something and then there's knowing something. I'm in that knowing something phase now, and I'm trying to bring you along with me in the macro. But what's happening right now is that there are two different types of financial system. There is a private financial system, specifically when we talk about blockchain and crypto, and then we've got a public financial system. Now, the private system is blocking out the public system, and there are specific rules and regulations and structures that are put in place by the private section that keep out the public section. So let's go a little bit deeper and give some examples. For example, in that private area, we have the likes of JP Morgan's Onyx, okay? JP Morgan's Onyx essentially is its own settlement asset. It does the job that we've all expected XRP to do. So this would be worrying, but we're going to get into why it's not so worrying later on and what needs to happen. But there is a private financial system that's taking place on private chains. So they're making their own cryptos, their own blockchains to handle their own money. So that if JP Morgan wants to send money to another one of JP Morgan's companies, it will just send using their Onyx token or whatever token they choose. And what they're calling them are deposit tokens. We covered deposit tokens probably years ago on this channel. And I really breezed over it for some reason. I'm just kind of reading through it all now and understanding the system better. And I'm thinking, oh, this is a problem because we've got JP Morgan's Onyx division and they're creating tools on the Annexes platform. Then in the UK, you've also got a private banking system called Finality, which is set up by the Bank of England. And the Bank of England has designated that system, Finality, under the settlement finality regulations. And this is a regulation set that makes sure that Finality and you got JP Morgan's Onyx all operate almost like a monopoly in the private banking, on a private chain banking. And then in addition, it's not just there, it's also in Japan, where they're using bank issued tokens to settle payments between major banks in Japan. So everywhere you look, this is unavoidable, this is inevitable, it will not change. Banks are settling in bank issued money. And that's a problem for XRP because if this wholesale system, the private chain financial system decide, oh, we're just going to settle with bank money, then XRP is pushed out. And if XRP gets pushed out of this private world and it has to now operate within the public world, what does that mean? Well, to me, that means, well, XRP is basically just like XLM at that point. operating in the public sphere, person to person. It's not doing anything like it was supposed to. The XRP is supposed to be this, I hate to say it, but the banker's coin. It's supposed to integrate into that system. But if it's not in that system, it's just XLM. And so if XRP ends up being treated like XLM, what's the point? Like, what is the point in XRP? And then the penny dropped. Ripple clearly understands this problem, and they have understood this problem. Every single move that Ripple keeps making, and I reflect back on the moves that they have made, it's all been in the pursuit of this one thing. And as I uncover the regulations and the different annexes of these different documents, I realize they know what they know what they're doing. They really know what they're doing. So I'm trying to communicate that to you because I've been deep in those documents, and I'm just going to tell you about them now. So Ripple clearly understood the problem that XRP was always going to have, trying to integrate itself into this private wholesale banking system. And as a result, they needed a Trojan horse. They needed a way to get into that system so that XRP can be at the heart of all of it. So they've basically jammed their foot in the door here with RLUSD, the stablecoin created by Ripple. And if you imagine RLUSD is the Trojan horse and inside is XRP, no one really knows XRP is in there. That's just all about the horse at this point. It's all about RLUSD. Because if Ripple wants to participate in this wholesale payments world, in the wholesale financial system, they must have an asset. They must contribute an asset that meets all of the regulations and is compliant with everything that the wholesale financial system need in an asset. Like if it's compliant with all of that, and of course we have signs that RLUSD is compliant because it's already been accepted in Dubai, and these are just proving grounds so that Ripple can take RLUSD to the wider financial system and say, hey, look, we're already accepted in Dubai, so let's just get this moving. So if all of the banks are using their own tokens to actually settle these transactions, that's JP Morgan's deposit tokens, or the stable coins that are going to come out of Japan, or the UK with Finality, Ripple's stablecoin, RLUSD, will also be part of that conversation as a compliant asset in that whole world. So you might be thinking, okay, but what about XRP? Like we've kind of left XRP out the system. You've got the private system and XRP is still there lingering in the public zone. Like what's going on? Well, here's where it becomes very interesting, because we know that XRP is an asset that you use in between two elements that don't talk to each other. There needs to be an asset in the middle that can allow for that transfer to happen. But there's a really big distinction that happens here. And we've all made this mistake, and I want to try and put my word of caution out there for everyone. We need to really stop talking about XRP as a currency or as a settlement asset. It does us zero favors. Settlement is when you close out a transaction. So you've got euro, there's the asset in between, and then you've got the recipient currency that they wanted. Once that final currency has been received, that is the settlement process. That's the moment of settlement. You'll notice, if you look at that in 3 different sections, XRP isn't at the end. So why do we call XRP the settlement token? It actually doesn't make any sense. And so what that tells me is that XRP needs to be defined as something else. The way that I think we should define XRP is not as currency. We're going to get into why in a second. Not as a currency, not as a settlement asset, as a conversion asset. There is actually a specific technical word that we need to use to describe XRP, but we're going to get into that in a second. Because RLUSD doesn't talk to JP Morgan's coin. USDT doesn't talk to RUSD. These are closed environments, and they are closed environments where the actual deposit token doesn't work. Like the wholesale deposit token doesn't work there for settlement. And there needs to be a conversion moment. So there needs to be a technology in the middle that does that conversion. We're not looking for an asset that settles. We're not looking for a currency that's going to run the whole world. We need a conversion asset. And by nature, just being a conversion asset makes XRP part of the infrastructure. Because as soon as you start viewing XRP as currency or a settlement asset, it starts to be brought under new regulations. There are new requirements for this. There's now a huge regulatory debate on what XRP is and how actually it can't be part of that wholesale system. It can't be part of the private system. It has to exist outside in the public space. We do not want that to happen. We want XRP to be from the public space, participating in the private space. And there are key regulations and key parts of these documents that we're going to uncover in this video. Because ultimately, if XRP is infrastructure, it's treated as a tool, and banks don't care about the tools you're using. They only care if it works. That's the difference. So There are 3 questions that I've really been asking myself here in this deep dive, and we're going to cover those one by one. So the first question we've kind of already answered, and that is about wholesale settlement, this private financial system. Where is it going? Where is it heading? And then as a result, why does that make XRP, fighting for XRP as a currency, why does that make that the wrong fight? And this is the key thing that's showing me that the private system, the wholesale system, is trying to keep the public systems out. There's a few tests that have taken place to test the interoperability between those, and that's what Chainlink is really doing great. And that's wonderful because we want that participation. But regardless of whether we get that participation or not, we want XRP to be involved in that private financial world. That's where the big money is. So if you go over to Bank of International Settlements and you look at a document called the Principles for Financial Market Infrastructures, if you go down to principle number 9, it says something very, very interesting that dictates how XRP's role can play or can't play in their system. And it says, FMIs, financial market infrastructures, should settle all their payments in central bank money where practical, and if not, in assets with little or no credit or liquidity risk. In other words, this commercial bank money must be used to settle these transactions where possible. And this document is ever evolving. In fact, on November the 7th, that whole document got an update. And it was tightening the rules on that, just reinforcing that the wholesale system, the private banking system, do not want the public system to be playing a role. They want to be left alone and settling their own payments. And the reason they're doing that, just sensibly thinking, they want to be able to control the assets that they're sending. They want to minimize their risk, and they want that legal finality of a transaction to be easy to prove from a legal perspective. The same thing is happening in the UK with Finality, we've already talked about that, and in Japan with their new tests about stablecoins with these major banks and settling in only bank-issued or central bank money. So if you try to claim that XRP is a currency, you start to hit this regulatory battle. You start to come under new definitions that don't serve XRP very well. Because if XRP acts like money, it will die like money. If it acts like infrastructure, it will run the entire system. So that leads me to question number 2, and that is, if XRP isn't currency, then how can it be infrastructure? Like actually how? What steps are required of XRP and the XRPL even to allow XRP to participate as infrastructure? And fortunately, if you dive into all the documentation, there is a small document in the Bank of International Settlements Annex F that I got into, and I realized actually we are so far along this journey that there's only a few more steps left. So let's get into an example. So let's say Bank A wants to send money to Bank B. They're going to each use their own settlement asset, right? Their own banker's coin, right? So that might be JP Morgan coin, and then you might have Citibank coin, just for example. The problem is with these two types of central bank money, they don't talk to each other. They don't translate. They are different. They're on different chains. They have the same purpose, but they're on different chains. So there needs to be a conversion asset. What I am describing there is a market. So JP Morgan to Citi is a market. This is a closed market. And so you need to make a market. And in order to make a market, you have to pre-fund an account, pre-fund that market with an amount of money or liquidity, or as I'm calling it here, of conversion asset, the asset that will convert the two to allow the settlement to take place. So that market, although they are using these bank issued deposit tokens, for example, if they don't talk, they're not settling. So you might want to go back to 2024. I think it was early on in 2024. And before then, we were talking about XLS 30D. Do you remember that? Well, on the XRPL, XLS 30D brought in this whole concept of automated market makers. We're not going to get too far into that. I do have a video somewhere about that. But essentially, when you've got a market that needs to be made, you need to put this asset in the middle, right? You need to put that conversion asset in the middle. People call it liquidity. So the XRPL now has the ability to do that, or at least it had it in 2024 and continues to. So I always thought that was interesting from a DeFi perspective, because then people could participate in markets and that's great. You can earn a yield and all that stuff. What I wasn't thinking about was these automated market makers, this XLS 30D, was actually made in compliance with the wholesale financial system. So there were the likes of clawbacks, for example. These are different features that are required by regulation by the wholesale banking system in order to be accepted into that system. They didn't make it for DeFi. I think they didn't. I think they made XLS30D or XLS30, sorry, not for DeFi. That was a happy coincidence and a happy kind of bonus for them. They made it to be compliant with the wholesale banking system, because when it came time, you were going to have to make these markets, like these central bank digital currency markets, like a JP Morgan coin and Citibank coin, or JP Morgan coin and the digital pound, whatever it is. Markets need to be made, and those markets need to be hosted somewhere where there is a native conversion asset. I think you're piecing this together with me. And those assets have to be pre-funded into accounts, so taken out of circulation to fund that market. Every conversion asset that is held in those accounts to make those markets must be frozen there and used for no other reason. So that means every market between every CBDC that doesn't talk to each other, every bank issued token or deposit token that doesn't talk to each other will require a conversion asset in the middle that is frozen in place and pre-funded for that purpose. Obviously that's quite exciting. And that AMM infrastructure in XLS30 has allowed now a new way to root value in that private world. And the Trojan horse is part of that as well with RLUSD, therefore allowing XRP to participate in the private world, in this wholesale world, without being an asset that's actually on these central banks' books, because it's not a currency. It's not a settlement asset, because they want the settlement assets. They want the currencies. Instead, it is a conversion asset. It's a really key distinction, and I'm going to close that loop in just a second here, and it's all going to go, oh, that's really cool. And I'm going to tie that in a second. We talked about how RLUSD is already compliant in Dubai. So they're making an asset that is wholesale system friendly and allows RLUSD to flow through the systems that the big banks are already building. There is no avoiding what they're building. All we have done is got the big horse through the gates. XRP's underneath, and they don't know it yet. And in fact, not only do they not know it yet, we don't need them to know. They don't even need to know. Now, there is an interesting thing happening, I mentioned it earlier, that is allowing public or retail financial systems to work inside the wholesale systems as well. And the connector between those two seems to be Chainlink. We saw a recent test between Swift and Chainlink just to test the interoperability of public and private. While I would say let's focus all on that, that's really interesting. It's, for me, the big money is in the private world. If we can have the bonus fact that, you know, they're working on integrating via that Swift system, the public chains and private chains, that's wonderful. That would just be great and make things easier. But I'd like to focus on the biggest hurdle first, because if we can get over that, yeah, the public to private thing is going to be super easy. So I know you might be wondering now, how do we get XRP out of the Trojan horse and just to roam around the city without anyone knowing? And this is coming full circle. It comes down to how we define XRP. So are you ready for this? This is how we want XRP to be defined. That was a drum roll, by the way. We need it to be defined as a critical service provider. Now, a critical service provider undergoes far less scrutiny as long as it does its job in a way that is reliable. And so what that means is we want XRP to be the conversion asset or the critical service provider. You cannot have the settlement of these big assets without a critical service provider. And you can't be a critical service provider without a certain amount of reliability under stressful situations. There's a few other things as well. And I was thinking, man, what does it take then? What does it take to become a critical service provider? Like, what are the rules? What criteria do we have to meet? Hours and hours and hours later, I found myself in Annex F of this Bank of International Settlements document. And there it is. The actual requirements that the XRPL and XRP would have to meet in order for it to become a critical service provider. Also learning about critical service providers. It doesn't matter if they're in the public chain or private chain. It doesn't matter if they're in the public chain. As long as they can provide this critical service to the system, they don't care. Additionally, as long as the technology that's being used in between doesn't come up on their books from their side, from a settlement and finality standpoint, they don't care. They just need it to be very reliable and do its job. So the ego that we have for XRP to be a currency in the global financial whatever we're saying now is actually hindering XRP's progression, because as soon as you name it that way, the regulators and the banks receive it that way. And they go, oh, that's not what we want. We've got our own thing for that. Thank you. And then the conversation's over. But if we can hush down about it, make it as a critical service provider and check these marks off that we're going to get into now under the Annex F document that I've shown on screen, and maybe I'm showing it now, we end up getting XRP out of the Trojan horse and simply running the city. Like running the city, and nobody really knows. The whole reason the whole city is standing up in the first place is because of XRP as a critical service provider. Just quietly underneath, it's the rails, not the loud people on the train. So that naturally leads into question number 3. What actually has to happen next for XRP as infrastructure, if we're talking about it as infrastructure, to be regulator blessed? Like if it's to become a critical service provider, what has to happen? And well, there are 3 requirements. If the XRP and XRP can meet these requirements, it can then be considered as a critical service provider and basically run the entire system. Number 1 is policy validation. So what I mean by that is, you've got Project Guardian. You might have heard of that from Singapore. You've also got the UK's digital security sandbox. These are testing environments, basically experiments by these big entities. And I specifically mentioned the ones that are most important. And it basically shows public chain inflow into the private chains. And it's testing the capabilities of doing that. And so what happens after these live pilots is that you'll get the likes of Project Guardian from the Monetary Authority of Singapore. They will release a document, and that document is called a legal finality opinion. And they also give a supervisory oversight statement. These 2 documents and what is inside of those saying, this was a success for these reasons are incredibly important, because you take those documents and you can take them over to the private banking section and say, hey, we're making a claim here that our company has a software underneath that's going to be a critical service provider. We think we can provide this critical service to the wholesale banking system. Look, we have the legal finality opinion and we have the oversight statement as well from these 2 big sandbox experiments. You would need XRPL and XRP to participate in these sandboxes and these projects. And then we need that opinion piece and the report. But that's the first piece. And the second part of this has to do with when I talked about settlement earlier. You need to be able to prove that the asset doesn't operate inside the wholesale system. So we mentioned that XRP is sitting outside of the wholesale system on the public chain, but then meaning that the banks and the wholesale system can essentially say, yeah, we have our own settlement tokens. That's all good. We want to keep only the assets in the wholesale system that we recognize and trust. And if you can prove that XRP actually does sit outside of that system, acknowledging that it doesn't meet the requirements for Principle 9 in that Bank of International Settlements document, then you're good to go and you're kind of cleared to say, okay, as long as you're not trying to get through this Principle 9, then we're fine, because we want to control everything in here. And what that means is the XRP layer sits outside of that system and outside of that settlement moment, which the banks are very precious about, and acts only as a conversion mechanism, as a critical service provider. And then third of all, you have something called operational assurance. Like I said earlier about Annex F, in order to meet the criteria for Annex F, you have to have some security here. You have to know that the system can handle the stress. And so in order to prove that the system can handle the stress, there are 3 documents, specific documents that Ripple or the XRP would have to publish and prove in order to be treated as a conversion asset or a critical service provider. And those documents are, I'm going to read them on the screen here, wind down plans, equity buffers, and a detailed incident response procedure. This covers everything about the public chain, essentially telling the private chain, the wholesale system, hey, we might be public chain, but we can actually handle the stress and we do everything in accordance to how you would want it done. It's super secure. We can handle massive inflows. We can handle minimal inflows. And even with the new updates that happened to this document on November the 7th this year, like literally a couple of days ago, we are still compliant and we can still follow the guidance. And if we can meet those standards, you can classify XRP as a critical service provider, silently working underneath everything, allowing the whole system to work. Now, Ripple hasn't published those documents yet. So if there's any time to put a Google search alert on your computer, it's now for those wind down plans, the equity buffers, and the incident response procedure documents published by Ripple or the XRPL. Because if you see these documents actually published and released, anyone else in the world might go, oh, like that's so boring, like not even pay attention to it. But you know now that if these 3 documents get released or these 3 elements get done, we are so close to having the public chain XRP working within the private system and holding the whole thing up. We will get more into that in the next couple of episodes here. As we go through the macro, what we're really doing here is developing a portfolio that moves along with this inevitable system. So with all the research, we're backing all of that up, basically saying, here's a massive portfolio that actually contains all the companies and the cryptos that are critical to this entire move of the financial system. And so while this video has been heavily focused on Ripple and the XRPL and XRP, there are a wide range of companies and cryptos, like Chainlink, for example, playing a massive role in this change. And so if you want to participate in the growth of this portfolio and the inevitable nature of it all over time, then maybe you want to look into some of those other assets. I've displayed them all very clearly with a nice little calculator for you, so you can put in how much money that you want your portfolio to be, and it will distribute based on your conviction about XRP and crypto, distribute all of that money among all of the different assets in the inevitable portfolio. And I even got a few links in there, one to eToro that will link you to the stocks that you can buy for the companies, and one to Caleb and Brown that will allow you to go over to get the cryptocurrencies that are in this portfolio. Because really what we want to do is make the most amount of money from this knowledge, because what's the point in doing all this research and listening to these videos for a long time if you're not going to apply that knowledge and position yourself in a way that is inevitably going to grow. So when I look at this conversation, there's a big elephant in the room for me personally. And that elephant is standing right in front of the door that I need to get through in order to go deeper into this conversation. Because the natural next phase of this conversation is okay, even the wholesale system with their own deposit tokens still need an asset in the middle to be a conversion asset. Now, I've alluded to the idea that XRP is that conversion asset, but is it? And that's the big question that the elephant in the room is posing. I need to answer that question in order to progress this research even further. Is XRP actually the one that's being chosen here? Are there any other competitors? Are there any other assets that can actually do this better than XRP? That is going to be the next episode of the macro. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with someone. It really helps when you click like and subscribe and share it around. We are at the cutting edge of where the financial system is, and every episode of the macro develops these thoughts further, researches more, and goes into depth with the specific documents and everything. If you're loving all of this right now, please subscribe and come in for the next episode of the macro in just a few days' time. Stay emotionless. I'll see you in the next episode of the macro.